Path of Exile 2 is finally here, and I've been having an incredible time playing the Sorceress, and today I'm going to be covering my Frost Mage build that I've been using for early game leveling through Act 1 and 2, and not only is it supremely effective, but it's a ton of fun. The build focuses around chilling and freezing enemies, which provides a ton of crowd control, and then shattering those enemies for huge damage. The best thing about this build is that I've tested it on both mouse and keyboard and controller inputs, and it works incredibly well on both input devices. So console players rejoice, there will be a planner link down in the comments or description below. Path of Exile 2 throws a ton of enemies at you very quickly in the game, and it became apparent to me early on that using cold damage was a powerful way of dealing with them. Cold damage from any source applies two ailments to enemies: chill and freeze. Chill is an ailment which slows the afflicted target, which can slow a target up to 50%, which is really going to help you kite enemies efficiently. The second ailment you apply is freeze, which you build up until it reaches 100 on an enemy, and then that causes them to become frozen. The great thing is you can apply both of these ailments to bosses as well. Now, not only were both of these ailments amazing for dealing with lots of enemies in terms of crowd control, but freezing enemies then shattering them was an incredibly powerful way of killing lots of enemies quickly. The whole shatter mechanic, which is when frozen enemies die and explode into ice particles, almost felt like at times I was able to bypass their normal health pool. But I'll need to do some more testing on that to confirm, and it might be just placebo. So when you start off the game, the first skill you get is Firebolt through that staff drop that you get early on, and the first skill gem you get is Arc. Now very quickly you want to replace the staff you get with a Gelid staff that gives you the skill Freezing Shards. This is commonly found as a drop early on, or if you're not good with RNG, then look out for this staff from vendors in the first town. Freezing Shards is a skill that doesn't use mana and is amazing for freezing enemies, especially for the first 10 levels of the game. It fires 7 projectiles, deals cold damage, and applies 50% more freeze inherently. This means that if multiple projectiles hit one enemy from one cast, it can be enough to freeze them instantly. So Freezing Shards becomes a very effective way of freezing enemies early on. I then added the Chain support gem to Freezing Shards, as then it lets it chain to other enemies and cause even more freeze. We don't really need to worry about the damage penalty from chain here. We're not using Freezing Shards as our DPS tool, it's mainly to freeze enemies. The first uncut skill gem you want to get is Ice Nova. Ice Nova applies cold damage in a radius around you, and if you spam it a few times, it can quickly freeze enemies. This is great when enemies get close to you early on to use as a defensive tool, but later on we'll actually be using Ice Nova offensively by running up to enemies and freezing them aggressively. The first support gem you want to prioritize is for Frost Nova, and that's Unleash. Unleash basically gives you these charges for your Frost Nova every few seconds. That means when you next cast Frost Nova, it will cast additional Frost Novas equal to the number of charges you saved up. So your first Frost Nova will actually now apply up to 3 Frost Novas, and that can quickly freeze enemies from just one single cast. I then added in the Glaciation support gem to improve the freeze buildup we apply, so we can freeze enemies now even faster. The second skill you want to quickly unlock is Frost Bomb. Frost Bomb creates a pulsating orb where your mouse is. Each time it pulses, it applies a debuff called Cold Exposure, which lowers the enemy's resistance to cold damage, meaning they will get hit harder by cold damage. After 3 seconds, the orb will detonate and cause a huge amount of cold damage. Now this skill is a hard hitter and will destroy packs of enemies with one hit. It's also an amazing tool for bosses because you only have to press it once, and then you can focus on dodging and running around avoiding the boss's attacks. Again, the first support gem for this you want to unlock pretty early on, and that's Magnified, which improves the AoE radius of Frost Bomb by 40%, which will help a ton. The second support gem, Spell Cascade, is something I added just recently, and although it lowers the radius and damage of Frost Bomb, what it does is it will now summon 2 extra Frost Bombs next to the one you cast in a linear fashion, which I found to be really powerful at dealing with large packs of enemies, or when a boss moves a lot. If you ever want to prioritize upgrading the level of a skill gem, make it Frost Bomb first, because the damage increase with each level is significant. At around level 14, you'll get your first level 5 skill gem, and you want to place this into Cold Snap. Cold Snap consumes the freeze effect on an enemy to instantly cause a shatter, dealing a large amount of damage in a small AoE radius. Cold Snaps are great at instantly deleting smaller, weaker enemies, and because we can freeze bosses, they're also great at doing chunks of health to bosses when you freeze them. Remember, don't instantly Cold Snap a boss when you do freeze them. Milk that frozen timer a little. Use some other skills during that time to apply some more damage, and then use Cold Snap at the last second to maximize it. Our other level 5 skill I recommend using is Solar Orb. Solar Orb lasts for a whopping 10 seconds and applies fire damage directly every 1.4 seconds, and then it can also ignite enemies directly. Ignite is another ailment, but this time this applies a fire damage over time effect. Combining this with the chills and freezes from the previous skills means Solar Orb can really have maximum effect because enemies stay rooted around the Solar Orb. Our final skill is the buff gem you get around level 15. I used it on Arctic Armor, which creates an icy barrier that has 3 charges. Each of these charges can apply cold damage when an enemy hits you with a melee hit, which is a nice final defensive layer to have. Once you have all these abilities unlocked, you don't really use freezing shards as much, so you can replace the staff in your build. So the gameplay loop becomes pretty simple. Use Frostbomb and Solar Orb preemptively, ideally in a spot where enemies are running towards or through, and that way you can funnel enemies through that area of damage. You can then run up to enemies aggressively, use Frost Nova to freeze them, and then use Cold Snap to do huge shatter damage. In the meantime, Frostbomb and Solar Orb will be doing huge amounts of damage each. Let's go over our passive skill tree next. The priority here is going to be getting nodes which improve our freeze build-up pretty quickly, allowing us to freeze and shatter enemies faster. So starting off, I highly recommend taking this route here and taking these energy shield nodes. Energy Shield is another great defensive layer and it regenerates fairly quickly. So if you're smart and you can kite enemies efficiently, your life pool can remain untouched for large amounts of time, which is really helpful in those early boss fights when you don't have too many charges of your potion left. I found this path on the right here much more useful for early level survivability than the left path here with spell damage nodes and mana regeneration. You do eventually reach the same spot, you go across here and get these mana regeneration nodes, and then we get the raw power node which gives us more intelligence and spell damage. Remember, intelligence gives us more energy shield and mana, which is super useful. I then came up here and picked up the Path of Winter node, which improves our cold damage and it increases the freeze we build up. Then we go across here picking up all these intelligence nodes until we can get the Shatter node here to improve our freeze build-up again even more. In terms of where to go on from here, the next 10 to 15 levels, I'm going to be focused on getting the Echoing Frost node here, which improves our elemental damage by 30% if we've chilled an enemy recently. I then want to come up here so we can get the Breath of Ice node, which improves our cold penetration against enemies, and then getting the Exploit the Elements node to improve our damage against enemies afflicted by any ailment. Eventually my plan is to roughly come up here, get the Eldritch Battery nodes and the Mind Over Matter node, which will help with survivability a lot I think, especially as we get deeper towards the end game. So we can stack mana and energy shield to help with our survivability. Other good nodes I'm looking out for include Arcane Intensity, which will boost damage per 100 mana and could really help to scale damage with mana stacking builds such as this one. And then we have Endless Blizzard all the way up here, which will add +1 to all cold spells, which is really powerful. In terms of gear, as this is an early leveling build, there's no mandatory gear requirements. Early on we did use a Freezing Shard staff, but very quickly as you unlock your other skills, I tend to find myself not using Freezing Shards as much anymore. Good modifiers to look out for on your weapons include increased cold damage, increased spell damage, +1 or 2 to cold skills, which can be really strong early on whilst leveling. Defensively, look for general modifiers such as energy shield modifiers, resistances, maximum life, which will all help with survivability. So there you have it, my early leveling Frost Mage build that will help you conquer Act 1 and Act 2 for the first 20 or so levels with ease. If you found this useful, remember to smash that like button, and I will be releasing more starter guides for other classes soon. So remember to hit that subscribe button as well. I'm Mr. Runner, and that's it for today. Peace out, guys.